It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning, Sofia Sanabrais, who's an independent scholar based in Los Angeles. Her research concerns the cultural and artistic exchanges between Asia and colonial Latin America. Currently, she is a Getty Scholar for the 2013-2014 annual theme, Connecting Seas, Cultural and Artistic Exchange at the Getty Research Institute, and is also teaching at the University of Southern California. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Sofia Sanabrais.
I want to mention, I think many of you knew the late Virginia Fields, the former curator of pre-Columbian art at LACMA, and she and I shared a love of many things, one of them being dogs. And we would have many conversations, and she had this term that she used, which was hybrid vigor, talking about the supremacy of mutts and how, everyone should have one. So whenever I think now of hybridity, I always think of Virginia Fields. And this morning going through the galleries, I couldn't help but I felt like her presence was everywhere, especially seeing the Colima dogs in Matthew's gallery. The connection between Japan and New Spain during the late 16th and early 17th century is rarely mentioned in the literature on colonial Latin American art. It is a subject that has been studied primarily by historians of religion who have examined the Christian century in Japan and economists who have investigated the global impact of the silver trade and the roles played by both Japan and New Spain during the early modern period. The encounter of these two cultures resulted in remarkable artistic exchanges fueled by their mutual curiosity in one another and the exchange of material culture in both commercial and religious atmospheres. However, because of their hybrid nature, the actual things, the evidence of these exchanges, have confounded mainstream art history and are really studied only by a handful of specialists. Govan Bailey, in his study of the Jesuit missions in Asia, addresses the problem encountered when studying the genre of hybrid art. Quote, "History is full of art that refuses to be categorized as belonging to one culture or another. A hybrid blend of two or more traditions, it is hard to reconcile with other works from either culture and winds up being neglected or even avoided by scholars, collectors, and the art-loving public alike. These objects are admittedly strange, startling, even unsettling, like the results of an experiment gone wrong." In his study of Japan and the Western world, the historian George Sansom considers the legacy of Spanish and Portuguese colonial enterprises on the peoples of East Asia. He maintains that while European culture barely affected the life and customs there before the 19th century, on the contrary, the impact of Asian material culture on Europe and its colonies was significant. He writes, "Even where Asiatic peoples were for long periods under European government, the essential nature of their civilization was little modified by their foreign rulers, who saw no profit in tampering with native customs and were inspired by no reforming zeal. Indeed, far from Europe affecting Asia, it was Asiatic goods that changed and enriched European life." Before the Italian merchant traveler Marco Polo embarked on his voyage to China in the 13th century, the exotic and mysterious region of the Asian world fascinated the West. By the 16th century, early modern European expansion to Asia in search of spices was well underway, and the quest for the evangelization of the non-Christian world soon followed. Portuguese and Spanish merchants took control of existing commercial centers and established new ones in places like Manila, Nagasaki, Goa, and Macau, creating one of the first empires of global trade. Japanese silver, once in high demand, was replaced by the silver pouring out of the mines of American cities like Potosi and Zacatecas, and China's demand for it facilitated the exchange and commission of Asian luxury goods by merchants and missionaries alike. The results of this eastward expansion far exceeded the mere exchange of commodities and signaled a new era in the global marketplace as objects and fine art from Japan, China, and India flooded the Iberian marketplace, introducing an entirely new material and visual vocabulary of artistic influence. Spanish America was profoundly affected by the influx of luxury goods from Asia that arrived from across the seas, especially on the galleons that made annual trips from Manila to the port of Acapulco in the Viceroyalty of New Spain from 1565 to 1815. the routes which can be seen here on this map. Travelers, writers, and administrative officials from all parts of the globe marveled at Manila's important role as a centerpiece of trade. Gemelli Carreri, the Italian traveler who circumnavigated the globe in the 17th century, remarked that, quote, "The author of Nature placed Manila so equally between the wealthy kingdoms of the East and of the West that it may be accounted one of the greatest places of trade in the world." The galleons were filled with luxury goods like silk, lacquer, and porcelain, as well as other natural products such as spices and tea. Many of these objects were distributed to local merchants for sale in Mexico City, while others continued southward to the Viceroyalty of Peru to satisfy a growing clientele. Exotic raw materials such as shell, ivory, and tortoiseshell, and fine arts like Japanese lacquer and folding screens aroused wonder, curiosity, and admiration in the Americas, spawning a globalized taste for Asian goods. It should therefore come as no surprise that the vogue for Asian things and the copying and adaptation of Asian forms, styles, and motifs in Mexican colonial art, like the folding screen or biombo, a Portuguese and Spanish transliteration of the Japanese word biobu, lacquer work from Pátzcuaro, and the renowned Talavera ceramics of the city of Puebla, predated by a century, that of chinoiserie and Japanisme in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Manila galleon trade transformed Mexico City into a major commercial center, and the market for Asian art affected a change in taste throughout the Americas and Europe, and introduced Asia into the colonial imagination. The high esteem in which those objects were regarded in the Hispanic world was expressed in an elaborate 1637 memorial on Philippine commerce and finances to King Philip IV of Spain and the Council of the Indies by the Procurator General of the Islands, Juan Grau y Monfalcon. Quote, "In Asia and the regions of the Orient," he writes, "God created some things so precious in the estimation of man and so peculiar to these provinces that, as they are only found or manufactured therein, they are desired and sought by the rest of the world." Japanese folding screens were first introduced to New Spain as exports by the way of the Manila galleon trade. In his History of the Philippines, published in 1609 in Mexico City, Antonio de Morga, a Spanish government official based in the Philippines, described the arrival of, quote, "good quality and finely decorated screens done in oil and gilt, arriving from Japan." Folding screens were also introduced by Japanese embassies that brought them to Mexico as gifts in the early decades of the 17th century. In 1614, 5 boxes of gilded biobu and 3 pairs of weapons were presented to the new Spanish viceroy by the renowned Hasekura mission, named after Hasekura Tsunenaga, a trusted vassal of the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, that visited Mexico City in the hopes of establishing direct trade. In Asia and many parts of the world, the act of gift-giving was essential in assuring the success of diplomatic relations. Politically motivated encounters between the East and West during the early modern period were frequent, and oftentimes, the gifts brought to Europe by Asian embassies proved to be influential to the development of native material culture. The gifts of Japanese folding screens had a profound effect in colonial Mexico, and this gesture of gift-giving further bestowed a certain sovereignty of taste to Japanese works of art, making them extremely desirable to collectors and patrons of art. Folding screens were soon crafted in Mexico and began appearing in the archival record in the first years of the 17th century. The versatility of the folding screen contributed to its quick adaptation to daily life. Because the biombo was freestanding, portable, multi-paneled, and could be painted on both sides, it provided an ideal surface on which to paint. The Japanese screen was adapted, recontextualized, and reinterpreted by artists and patrons. The materiality of Asian art forms conveyed meaning in colonial society. To own a biombo implied an appreciation of Japanese art. It was also an indicator of a certain level of refinement and education. Patrons of some of the most elaborate and grand biombos were viceroys, government officials, and elite members of society. Many of the biombos produced in Mexico depicted mythological scenes or scenes of daily life, like this one here. The left 3 panels The left three panels, there are two missing, depict the Alameda, a large park in the center of Mexico City, and the 5 right panels illustrate the Palace of the Viceroy in the Zócalo or Plaza Mayor of Mexico City. The one element that most of you probably notice here is the use of gold clouds more as a decorative element. The use of gold clouds as a compositional device is characteristic of Japanese screens of the late 16th and 17th centuries. The screen may also call to mind the genre of the rakuchu rakugai folding screens that depict pictorial vignettes from bird's eye view that illustrate a multitude of figures engaged in the varied life and activities of the capital. And I make this comparison because there are a group of Mexican screens that also depict these scenes inside the capital and outside of the capital, the southern environs and the canals, and then also the center of the city. Grand historical subjects like the conquest of Mexico, seen here, were also common. On the screen is a remarkable example that depicts the conquest of Mexico on the front and the viceregal capital of Mexico City on the back. Various scenes of the conquest play out over the 10 front panels, among them the meeting of Cortes and Moctezuma, and the siege of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. On the back, the transformation of the Aztec capital into the orderly Spanish colonial city, replete with the city's numerous churches and plazas, invites the viewer to meander among the streets, searching the legend at the bottom left for familiar sites within the city's boundaries. Scenes like this may call to mind examples of Japanese byobu that depict maps and city scenes. The unique and innovative format of the folding screen provided new ways for artists to depict subject matter. It differed from the usual format and iconography of an altarpiece, a devotional painting, or a portrait, and was intended for domestic use. Freed from the constraints of the Catholic Church, artists utilized the full artistic potential of the folding screen. The subject matter reserved for the biombo was the only form of secular imagery, besides portraiture, to flourish in New Spain, and was among the most important contributor to the spread of secular art during the 17th century. In the 18th century, we see a very different tradition forming. The biombo became an integral part of the material culture of New Spain, and today is seen as one of the hallmarks of Mexican colonial art. By 1726, the Diccionario de Autoridades, published by the Royal Spanish Academy, defined the word biombo in the following manner: a type of screen made of painted cloth or paper, stretched over a frame and connected by hinges. It can be opened, closed, and folded as necessary. It can be used to divide and partition off large rooms, protect the rooms from wind, and to hide beds and other things that are not meant to be displayed. It is a treasure that came to us from China or Japan, and from there comes the word. A collective curiosity about Japan and New Spain peaked during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, as many Creole friars joined the missionary efforts in East Asia. The connection between Japan and Mexico was further intensified with the martyrdom of Mexico City-born San Felipe de Jesus, the country's first Creole saint and one of the ill-fated group of 26 Christians martyred in Nagasaki in February 1597, of which numerous paintings abound in Mexican collections. However, while the vast majority of sources published during the period document the activities of Europeans in Japan, relatively little is known about the sojourn of Japanese embassies of 1610 and 1614. Their visits to Mexico City were chronicled by the Nahua historian Chimalpayin in a manuscript known today as the Diario, or the Diary, that records the events in the viceregal capital from 1589 to 1615. He included eyewitness accounts of their activities, including multiple mass baptisms of the Japanese. Chimalpayin wrote about Japanese merchants who accompanied the delegations to Mexico, noting that during their 4-year sojourn in the capital, they had, quote, they had earned money and sold all of the merchandise in Mexico City that they brought with them from Japan. The revelation that Japanese merchants lived and worked in Mexico City for a 4-year period selling merchandise is remarkable, as it provides insight on the accessibility and consumption of Japanese goods. To date, the types of objects in the inventories of Japanese merchants remains unknown. However, my own research in archives throughout Mexico and Spain reveals that folding screens, both Mexican and Japanese lacquer works were among the things that people owned. Therefore, it is very likely that folding screens and Namban lacquer works, including lacquer altars and objects like these, were among the items the merchants brought with them, as they were inherently portable and were among some of the most popular works of art commissioned by the Jesuits based in Nagasaki and Macau. Nagasaki was the principal port of Japanese trade with the West and was one of several cities engaged in East Asian and Southeast Asian trade networks. Junks from Japan frequently sailed into the port of Manila from Nagasaki, laden with rich cargo headed for Acapulco. Once a year between 1543 and 1640, Portuguese merchants accompanied by Jesuit missionaries entered the Bay of Nagasaki en route from Macau. The Portuguese were called Namban, or Southern Barbarians, and this designation also applied to works of art, both religious and secular, that reflected contact with the West and was an implied hybridity. The Jesuits established a seminary of painting to furnish works of art for Japanese churches and also commissioned local craftsmen to make objects, portable alterns, triptychs, and lecterns for devotional and liturgical use and for export to the West. The height of artistic production of these Namban pieces was between 1590 and 1614. Many of these pieces, however, were confiscated and destroyed during the persecution of Japanese Christians. Over the past year, much of my research has focused on identifying Namban art in Mexican collections to further understand the adaptation and reinterpretation of Namban elements in Mexican colonial art. One of the most common sites of this reinterpretation is on colonial frames. You can see here this, on the outside. And these frames actually are most often found on enconchados. This is a wonderful piece from LACMA where the images are inlaid with mother of pearl, as you can see, and in the previous example. Like the biombo in colonial Mexico, Namban liturgical objects provide tangible evidence of the cross-cultural interaction that occurred between Japan and the West during the so-called Christian century. These hybrid portable altars, or seigan, reveal a purely Western form with Japanese material and decorative elements. Black lacquered wood, a rich and profuse use of gold, and inlaid mother of pearl that undoubtedly influenced Mexican enconchados, which is the subject of a whole nother paper. Captivated by the incredible beauty and intrinsic qualities such as the smoothness, luminosity, and durability of Japanese lacquers, these works were commissioned by the Jesuits for shipment to Spain and Portugal, and by the Augustinians, Franciscans, and Dominicans for shipment to New Spain through the Philippines. The appreciation and consumption of Asian art by the Mexican elite and its incorporation into liturgical objects in Mexico reveals how certain objects were valued, as well as the naturalization of these pieces for religious use, a unique example visible in the incorporation of Edo period-style panels into the pilgrimage church of San Miguel del Milagro in Tlaxcala. And you can go today to see this incredible church. And in the use of Chinese porcelain on Mexican altars, especially in the paintings depicting the holy image of the Cristo de Chalma. I believe that besides the byobu, Namban portable altars formed part of the inventory of the Japanese merchants who lived and worked in Mexico City. It seems likely that merchants would have transported portable liturgical objects, given that they were commissioned in Japan by religious orders during the height of international trade. Namban objects like portable altars and missal stands were highly coveted in colonial Mexican collections and can be found in private collections today. Now, this talk will take a little bit of a shift from the influence of Japan to New Spain and look to the possibility that New Spain was influencing Japan, challenging Sansom's claim that there was only a unidirectional influence from East Asia outwards. The focus of my present research is a Namban altar in the collection of the Tokyo National Museum that provides visual testimony to the contact and exchanges between Japan and Mexico in the early modern period. Unlike the majority of portable altars that include paintings in the central niche, I immediately recognized a Mexican feather painting depicting the martyrdom of Saint Stephen. you can see his figure. He's kneeling here, and behind him here are rocks that are about to be thrown. I don't know if that's... Okay, I thought that was mine. I was going to be so mortified. It was my own phone. As you can see, the feathers and colors have degraded, and what remains are the remnants of gold on the saint's body, halo, and in the rays emanating from the sky. Feather paintings are extremely fragile, and too much light, exposure, and temperature and humidity fluctuations are detrimental to the organic nature of the materials. On the other side of the conservation spectrum is a recent rediscovery in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum of a feather object forgotten for over 60 years. This 17th century Mexican feather fan, this is the front, here's the back, entered the collection of the Peabody Essex in 1947 as a gift. Merely identified as fan, it was placed into collection storage until its rediscovery in 2004. So I suggest all of you to go through your inventory of fans. Japanese fans were among the most sought-after items among the women of the Spanish and Portuguese courts. The Spanish Habsburgs were known collectors of Asian objects, especially Joanna of Castile, the wife of John II of Portugal. She amassed a large collection of Chinese, Japanese, and Indian objects that arrived to Lisbon from Goa, and among her most prized possession were Japanese fans. The image of a Japanese couple illustrated in the Boxer Codex of 1595 shows that the fan was in fact an accessory closely tied to Japanese identity. The history of Mexican colonial feather paintings is well documented in the scholarship. And here I've placed one that's in extremely good condition alongside the one in the Tokyo National Museum, so you can get a sense of the degradation of the color in the altarpiece in question. Featherworks are among the first objects from the New World commissioned and valued by the Spaniards. Extravagant liturgical garments were crafted for members of the clergy. Chasubles, copes, and even bishops' mitres were fabricated out of feathers, one being gifted to Pope Paul IV. In the early colonial period, Spanish missionaries oversaw the work of local feather artists, known as amantecas, seen here illustrated in the Florentine Codex, who created Christian images based on European prints. The iridescent feathers from hummingbirds and other native birds that held special meaning for the Aztecs were carefully trimmed and applied into layers onto a mate or maguey paper using orchid-based glues. The most famous example of this type of artistic production was overseen by the friar Pedro de Gante at the school of San Jose de los Naturales. Founded in 1527 on the site of Moctezuma's former aviary and royal workshops, San Jose de los Naturales was the first school set up to teach Christian doctrine to the native Mexicans by the Spaniards in Mexico City. Colonial featherworks were highly prized and were often sent to Europe as gifts. The most famous and earliest example of the colonial featherworking tradition is the Mass of St. Gregory, which was commissioned in Mexico City in 1539 as a gift for Pope Paul III. The uniqueness of these feather paintings, accentuated by the iridescence of the colored feathers, made these some of the most precious gifts of the New World. In fact, in 1569, when the Jesuits set out for Africa, among the many gifts that were presented to the King of Mozambique was a feather painting depicting the Ecce Homo, a gift from King Philip II of Spain. Letters from Jesuit missionaries in Japan also revealed the desire for Mexican feather paintings, informing us that the works were circulating throughout Asia during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. In a letter dated November 8, 1585, from Pedro Gomez, the superior of Bungo province in Japan, to the Archbishop of Évora, writes, quote, "Please send a picture of feathers that comes from the Indias de Castile, small or large, as in these parts they are of great esteem." This altar feather painting combination is the only known example of its kind in a Japanese collection. As I mentioned, it is likely that similar altars may have been among those brought to Mexico by the Japanese merchants. Is it possible that Mexican feather paintings may have been included among the reciprocal gifts to the Japanese embassy? There is no documented record of what gifts the Mexicans would have sent back to Japan, but as I mentioned earlier, featherworks were often reserved as gifts for foreign rulers. So currently, together with my colleague Anton Schweizer, a specialist in Japanese art, we've begun to explore the meaning, exchange, and use of feathers in Japan and Mexico, looking at garments like the Japanese jimbaori, a garment that high-ranking samurai wore over their armor, decorated with feathers, like this one in the British Museum and one in the Victoria and Albert, as well as Catholic vestments. And I included this. This is one from the British Museum. This is in a Italian collection, and this is an image of the ruler Nezahualcóyotl wearing a feathered garment as going into battle. So is there a link between these two traditions? I can't be sure just yet, but this is an ongoing project. What I do know is that there was interest in Japan for Mexican feathers. Japanese records reveal that in 1616, 2 Mexican ships departed Acapulco. Together they carried around 800,000 pesos of silver for the Manila treasury, but no trade goods to speak of. As they neared the Philippines, they were hit by a terrible storm and landed at 2 different ports in southwest Japan. Among the items that survived was a collection of Mexican feathers. In Tosa, the local daimyo wanted to buy a number of items from the Spaniards, but was not successful. A letter from a samurai bargaining on behalf of the daimyo, dated September 29, 1616, mentions the feathers. Quote, "There is 1 red bird feather, 2 yellow feathers, 1 blue feather, and 2 white feathers. I saw these and said, 'Sell them to me,' but the Spanish would not agree." Interestingly, what this letter reveals to us is the prized and precious nature of the feathers, not only for the Spanish, but also for the Japanese. So this is just the beginning of a project that I'm working on. So to end, I would like to show you a work from a private collection in Mexico City that really speaks volumes of the high esteem that Japanese lacquers were held in Mexico City, as it holds the most revered image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So this is a 16th century altar and an 18th century painting. And, at once it is Japanese, it is Mexican, but it is really kind of a telling example. So I hope to do a little more work on this. The introduction of Japanese art, like the byobu and other Namban lacquer works, into a Mexican colonial society that coveted Asian commodities forever changed the artistic landscape. Those works that were desired and sought by the rest of the world, whether they exchanged hands through commercial or diplomatic means, provided new possibilities for artistic expression. My venture into the Mexico-Japan connection related to feathers leaves me with more questions than answers about the understanding and awareness of Mexican colonial art in Japan and how it was adapted and reinterpreted there. But rather than see these types of hybrid objects as startling or unsettling, what I see is the presence of hybrid vigor. Thank you.